All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive. We're looking at a really interesting period in India's fight for independence.
Definitely an important one.
The rise of militant nationalism from 1905 to 1909. So we're pulling most of our insights today from Chapter 12 of this history book.
Good stuff.
And the big question is, how did a movement for complete independence, like totally breaking away from the British Empire,
Right.
how did that gain so much traction in just those few years?
Yeah, well, to really understand that surge in what they called militant nationalism,
Okay.
we have to kind of rewind a bit, back to the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Okay.
There was a lot of frustration building up even then, even among Indians who thought, maybe working within the system would be enough.
So you're talking about those who believed in gradual change.
Exactly.
The ones we often call the moderates, appealing to British fairness, working through the councils, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But there were a bunch of things that happened that really chipped away at that hope of, gradual reform working out.
Yeah, I was reading about that. Like, take the Indian Councils Act of 1892.
Oh, yeah.
On paper, it was supposed to give Indians more say in government, but in reality, it didn't really deliver.
Nowhere near what people hoped for. A lot of Indians felt like, okay, so our voices still don't truly matter.
Right, right. And then on top of that, you have the British government deporting the Nadu brothers in 1897. No trial, nothing. And of course, they imprisoned Tilak.
Bal Gangadhar Tilak, yeah. He was one of the leading nationalist figures at the time.
Yeah.
And, they slapped him with sedition charges. I mean, can you imagine the impact that had?
Oh, it must have sent shockwaves through the entire movement.
Absolutely. And they didn't stop there. It's like one thing after another. Repressive laws, tightening the grip on freedom of the press, you name it.
Like the Official Secrets Act of 1904. Basically, you couldn't criticize the government.
Right. And the Indian Universities Act more control over universities.
They saw them as hotbeds of dissent, which, let's be honest, they often were.
Yeah.
So you've got this growing sense of disillusionment among Indians. And then you have this new generation of leaders emerging. Tilak, who we've already mentioned, but also Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai.
Yeah, this was a different breed. These guys weren't interested in just sending petitions. They were what they called the extremists.
Right.
And their vision, much bolder. They wanted complete independence, full Swaraj self-rule.
Which had to sound pretty radical to those used to the moderates' approach.
Absolutely. It resonated with a lot of people, though, people who were tired of being controlled. But it's also important to remember this wasn't happening in a vacuum. A lot of things happening around the world were feeding into this more radical stance.
Like what?
Well, look at Japan. They were becoming a major industrial power, and then they defeated Russia in 1905. That really shook things up.
It showed that European powers weren't invincible. So other colonized nations, like India, started to believe, hey, maybe we can break free too.
Exactly. It was like a domino effect. And the extremists, they were drawing inspiration not just from Japan. There were nationalist movements gaining steam all over Ireland, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, Persia, China.
It was a global wave of anti-colonial sentiment.
Exactly.
Okay, so you've got this backdrop of frustration with British rule. You've got these new, bolder leaders and this global anti-colonial wave.
Right.
And then in 1905, the British make what, from my perspective, seems like a huge blunder.
Yeah.
They partition Bengal.
Oh, the partition. Now, the British, they said it was for administrative efficiency.
Right.
But a lot of people saw it as a way to weaken the nationalist movement. Classic divide and rule strategy.
Bengal was this region with a strong sense of unity, culturally, linguistically. And they split it into two provinces, one with a Hindu majority, one with a Muslim majority.
Yeah. And they thought that would somehow make things easier to manage.
I mean, it seems so short-sighted. Did they really think pitting Hindus and Muslims against each other would make the independence movement just go away?
They hoped so. But wow, did that backfire. Instead of weakening the movement, it gave Indians a common enemy, something to unite against.
It was seen as a direct attack on their shared identity and their heritage.
Ah.
Which brings us to a really pivotal moment. The birth of the Swadeshi movement.
Oh, yeah.
This wasn't just about protests or petitions. This was about reclaiming their identity, their economic power.
It was about self-reliance, rejecting British economic dominance, boycotting foreign goods, particularly British ones, promoting Indian-made products instead.
So hitting the British where it hurt their wallet.
Right, but also fostering this sense of national pride, of economic independence, and it really caught on. Millions of Indians started choosing Indian-made cloth, salt, sugar, you name it.
Instead of buying British imports.
Yeah, and the leaders, they were smart about it. They used traditional festivals, religious gatherings, public meetings, all to spread the message of Swadeshi.
So it was very well organized.
Oh, yeah. They even formed these volunteer groups, Samitas, to teach people how to make their own goods, develop local industries.
So it wasn't just a boycott. It was about building a whole parallel economy, empowering Indians to take control.
Absolutely.
But even with all this energy, all this momentum, there were divisions brewing within the movement itself. We've talked about the moderates versus the extremists. But how did that actually play out?
Well, those differences became more and more pronounced. Imagine two groups. Both want to reach the same destination,
Right.
but they have totally different ideas on how to get there.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. The moderates, a lot of them were educated elites, right? They still believed in reasoned argument, gradual reform.
Okay.
They saw British rule as flawed, sure, but something that could be fixed eventually.
Yeah. Whereas the extremists were much more, shall we say, impatient.
They saw British rule as inherently exploitative. They wanted a clean break, complete independence, and they wanted it now.
And it's important to remember, they'd seen the moderates' approach fail over and over again.
Right. Petitions ignored, promises broken. So to them, compromise just wasn't an option. And that message, as radical as it sounded, resonated with a lot of people. People were fed up.
And that ultimately led to the split within the Indian National Congress, the Surat split of 1907.
Ah, the Surat split. That was a defining moment.
The moderates go one way, the extremists the other. The movement fractured, and that, of course, made it easier for the British to crack down.
Yeah, they swooped in, tightened the screws even more. Things like the Seditious Meetings Act, the Indian Press Act.
Less freedom of assembly, less freedom of the press, and of course, as we mentioned, key leaders like Tilak were imprisoned.
Yep. And then the British do something that seems smart but also kind of naive. The Morley-Minto reforms in 1909.
Right.
It's like they were trying to appease the movement, but at the same time trying to divide it even further. On the surface, some concessions, they expanded the legislative councils, allowed more Indians to participate, but they also introduced this thing, separate electorates for Muslims.
So giving Muslims their own constituencies.
Right, and that was meant to drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims.
A classic tactic. But, it's fascinating because on the one hand, you have these reforms that seem to give Indians more self-governance. But on the other hand, you're creating this potential for serious communal tension.
Yeah. The Morley-Minto reforms, they were a double-edged sword, showed how clever the British could be, but also how little they understood the forces at play in India.
Well, it sounds like we've got a lot to unpack in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll see how all this unfolds.
Definitely. Things are about to get even more interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, those Morley-Minto reforms, they really were something, weren't they? Like, they thought they were so clever, trying to, outsmart the movement.
Right.
But really, they just handed them a whole new weapon, didn't they?
In what sense?
This idea that, we can use these communal tensions, Hindus against Muslim.
Right. I mean, you mentioned how these reforms backfired, right?
Yeah.
How they just ended up making Indians even more resentful of British rule.
Big time.
Yeah.
It's like, hello, you can't just manipulate people like that and think there won't be consequences.
I mean, it's almost like they planted the seeds for the partition of India in 1947.
It's hard not to see the connection, isn't it?
Like a direct line from those reforms to that tragic event.
Yeah. It shows you playing politics can have long-lasting effects, way beyond what anyone intended.
Yeah, wow. But, okay, let's not jump too far ahead.
Right, yeah.
We're still talking about this specific period, right? 1905 to 1909, the era of militant nationalism.
Right.
Even if it didn't lead to immediate independence, it was still a hugely transformative time, like a crucible. It's like they were experimenting with all these different approaches, right?
They were.
Trying to figure out how to take on the British Empire. And the one that really seemed to capture people's imaginations was the Swadeshi movement.
Yeah, with its focus on self-reliance, economic resistance. I mean, think about it. Ordinary people all across India making this conscious decision to say, okay, we're buying Indian-made goods, we're supporting our own industries.
And we're boycotting the colonizers' stuff.
Exactly. It was a powerful statement.
Right.
Like, We're not going to be your economic puppets anymore.
And you could just feel that energy, can't you?
You can. It's like this collective sense of purpose, people coming together to build something new, not just tearing something down.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about economics either.
Right. You had this whole cultural revival happening alongside it. Art, literature, music, even science.
Yeah, reclaiming their heritage. After being told for decades that British culture was the only one that mattered.
It's like they were saying, we are Indian and we're proud of it.
Exactly. And that was something the British couldn't control, no matter how much military might they had.
Or how many clever laws they passed.
Right. It was about something deeper, something the British just didn't get.
This need to assert your own identity, especially when someone's trying to erase it. But even with all this happening, right, this surge of national pride, this economic resistance, you still had these divisions within the movement, like we talked about before, moderates and extremists.
Right, and that tension, it runs through almost every movement for social change, doesn't it?
This pull between being practical and being idealistic.
Right.
Working within the system versus wanting to completely overturn it.
In India's case, it was really stark. You had the moderates, a lot of them were these educated elites.
Right.
They still believed in reasoned debate, gradual change.
Okay.
They saw British rule as flawed, but, fixable eventually.
Right, like you could reason with them.
Yeah, kind of. Then you had the extremists who were like, no, this system is rotten to its core. We need to get rid of it completely, and we need to do it now.
Right, and for them, that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. They'd seen how the moderates' approach just hadn't worked.
Right, decades of petitions and politely asking for change.
Exactly. So for the extremists, compromise wasn't an option. It was surrender. And that message resonated with a lot of people. People were tired of waiting.
Right, and so you have the Surat split in 1907.
Yeah, that's where it all came to a head, didn't it?
The Indian National Congress basically splits in two.
Yep. Moderates one way, extremists the other.
The movement is fractured. And that, of course, is exactly what the British wanted.
Oh, they were thrilled. Divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the book.
So in a sense, they won, right?
In the short term, maybe. But those seeds of change, they'd already been planted.
Right. This era of militant nationalism might have faded after 1909, but it left a lasting legacy. New ideas, new tactics. It had shown people what was possible.
Absolutely.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into India's era of militant nationalism. It's been quite a journey so far.
Yeah, it has. Lots of twists and turns.
But even with all the setbacks, you can really see how crucial this period was for India's eventual independence.
It's like we've been putting together this puzzle piece by piece, seeing all these different forces at play.
The clashing ideologies, the strategic mistakes, the unexpected victories. I mean, it's all there.
Yeah. As we wrap up this exploration, what do you think is the biggest thing that came out of this era? What's the most significant legacy?
That's a great question. For me, I think it's this shift in mindset.
Oh, interesting.
Before this period, the British seemed invincible. But the era of militant nationalism, it showed everyone that ordinary Indians, if they worked together, if they truly believed, they could actually take on the empire.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I mean, look at the Swadeshi movement. It wasn't just about economics, right?
No.
It was the statement, we can do this ourselves.
Okay.
We can produce our own goods, build our own industries. We don't need you.
And it almost feels like the Swadeshi movement was like a first draft of nonviolent resistance.
Oh, I see what you mean.
The strategies that Gandhi would later use. Self-sufficiency, consumer power, mobilizing the masses, all of that started here.
Yeah, for sure. Those ideas took root during this time, and they were powerful.
But it wasn't just the practical stuff, right?
Right.
You had this cultural revival happening at the same time. A rediscovery of Indian art, literature, music, science. It was like reclaiming their pride after decades of being told, oh, British culture is better.
Oh, for sure. That cultural resurgence, it was essential. It helped unite people, across different religions and regions, reminded them that they were all Indian, first and foremost.
And do you think the British ever really grasped how powerful that was?
I don't think so. They were so focused on imposing their cultural norms that they totally underestimated how much people need to connect with their own heritage.
Yeah. And that need to express your own identity, that's something that goes way beyond just India or British colonialism.
Oh, absolutely. It's universal. It's human.
And it's still relevant today. Think about all the debates we have about globalization,
Yeah.
preserving local traditions, this tension between becoming the same versus staying different.
It's all connected to those same fundamental questions, isn't it? Who are we?
Right. How do we define ourselves, especially in a world that's changing so fast?
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about how this era, this era of militant nationalism impacted India's fight for independence. But for us, sitting here in the 21st century, what are the lessons?
Ooh, that's a good one. What can we take away from all this?
How can we connect this history to our own lives?
Well, I think there are a few things that really stand out. First of all, it reminds us that change is possible, even when the odds seem totally stacked against you.
Yeah.
It shows how powerful it can be when people come together, believe in something bigger than themselves, and stand up to injustice.
And it also shows how tricky social movements can be, right?
Yeah.
All those internal divisions, like the split between the moderates and the extremists, they weakened the movement.
Yeah.
Made it easier for the British to step in and control things.
Right. It's a reminder that unity is fragile and compromise. Well, sometimes it's the only way to actually achieve something lasting.
Right, right. And we also have to remember how unpredictable history is. Think about the partition of Bengal.
Yeah.
The British thought it would weaken the movement, but it ended up doing the opposite.
They totally underestimated the unifying power of that decision.
So it's like that saying, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans.
Yeah, for sure. History has a way of throwing curveballs, and that's why we need to be adaptable.
Flexible in our thinking, flexible in our strategy.
Exactly, because what works in one situation might not work in another. You got to be willing to experiment, to try new things, to learn from your mistakes.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into this era, I'm honestly just blown away by the people who fought for India's freedom. Their courage, their conviction, their creativity. I mean, they faced so many challenges.
Yeah.
Setbacks, disappointments. They went through it all, but they never gave up on that dream of Swaraj.
It's truly inspiring. It's a reminder that the human spirit is incredibly resilient, And when people work together, they can achieve incredible things.
Absolutely. Well, it's been fantastic exploring this period of history with you.
It really has. And to our listeners, we hope you've gained a deeper understanding of what led to India's independence. It's a complex story with so many factors at play.
So many layers.
But we encourage you to keep digging, keep learning.
Yeah.
There's so much more to discover.
And so many lessons we can apply to our own lives, even today.
Until next time, keep diving deep.